before Spider-Man No Way Home came out, we'd accepted that the stories of Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's Peter Parkers were over. While it was a fun surprise getting more closure on those two versions of the characters, it might not be over yet. In this video, we're going to talk about the possibility that Maguire's Spider-Man 4 could actually happen, as well as some fun behind-the-scenes facts about the MCU Spider-Man. First up, reports say that Maguire is excited to don the red and blue suit once again. It looks like between his appearance in No Way Home and building the so-called Sony Spider-Man universe, Maguire sees an opportunity to continue his story where it left off. Of course, where it left off in this case refers to Spider-Man 3, which came out all the way back in 2007. Supposedly, Sam Raimi and Kirsten Dunst would be happy to join if Sony would have them. Unfortunately, those same reports say that Sony isn't reciprocating Tobey's excitement and would rather get Andrew Garfield to return, or ideally, score exclusive rights to Tom Holland. Next, let's look at why that's the case. There are a few reasons why Sony doesn't want to go ahead with Tobey. The actor's career has been erratic, with him significantly reducing his acting load from 2007 to around 2013. It's easy to forget, but Tobey was a big name in the 2000s. That's why he was cast as Peter Parker. But that isn't really true anymore, and the only people who'd care to see Tobey Maguire as Spider-Man now are those who are nostalgic for Sam Raimi's trilogy. Another reason would have to do with his age. Maguire is 47 years old now, and Sony hasn't even started shooting a Spider-Man movie. It's a shame, but the actor is just too old to book a long commitment for a superhero franchise. There's a reason why Marvel Studios went with the baby-faced Tom Holland for their Spider-Man. Now, this report does make us sad for the Spider-Man 4 that never was. Wait, did you know there was almost a Spider-Man 4? If not, then get cozy, cause it's story time. Sam Raimi, who directed Tobey Maguire through his trilogy of movies, was pretty frustrated with his experience making Spider-Man 3. He wanted to do a movie that featured Sandman as the villain, but mainly focused on resolving the conflict between Peter Parker and Harry Osborn. Sony, however, wanted to spice up the movie by including the popular character of Venom in the flick. Since the biggest complaint against Spider-Man 3 was the way its attention was divided between three villains, you could argue that studio interference ruined Spider-Man 3. Surprisingly, Raimi wasn't deterred by this experience, and he was game for Spider-Man 4. The core cast, including Maguire and Kirsten Dunst, were up for it as well. There was so much confidence in the future of this franchise that Sony was even laying down the groundwork for the 5th and 6th movies. We could have had 2 Raimi trilogies. Imagine that. The 4th film would have featured the recurring character Dr. Kurt Connors, becoming the Lizard and playing the main villain. Additionally, Raimi's best friend Bruce Campbell would play Quentin Beck and Mysterio. Later down the line, it was reported John Malkovich and Anne Hathaway were being tapped for Vulture and Felicia Hardy. We found out this past April that Kraven the Hunter was also planned for the 4th Spider-Man. Moving on, do you all see where this is going? Clearly, Sony wanted to include as many popular Spider-Man villains as they could once again, as if that strategy had worked for Spider-Man 3. And even though Raimi came to hate the fact that he was forced to include Venom in Spider-Man 3, he was still willing to play ball with Sony on their increasingly absurd requirements. The thing that really killed the movie was that Sony wasn't happy with the actual scripts that Raimi was turning in. The flick was scheduled for a 2011 release, and time was running out. Sony had rejected 4 iterations of a script, and the director couldn't see a way to please Sony. With no option besides compromising on his own creative integrity, Sam Raimi opted to exit the movie. Following that, Sony canceled the 4th Spider-Man movie altogether, signaling the end of Tobey Maguire's run as the character. It's because Spider-Man 4 failed that Andrew Garfield ever got to be Spider-Man. Now, was it worth losing Spider-Man 4 to get the Amazing Spider-Man movies? We'll let you be the judge of that. It's interesting to note, though, that Sony didn't really even learn their lesson from the experience of working with Raimi. Well, the first Amazing Spider-Man had only 1 villain, the second one had 3 again, and it tried to build a cinematic universe. One thing's looking pretty certain right now. Regardless of what Tobey Maguire wants, once, Spider-Man 4 is no more. We'll now move on to the MCU, where Marvel Studios is putting its foot down. One of the issues surrounding Tom Holland's Peter Parker has to do with his origin story. When we meet him for the first time in Captain America: Civil War, Parker has already been doing small-scale work as the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, while living with his Aunt May and going to high school. There are mentions of a father figure who died, but that never gets explored as Tony Stark takes the reins of mentoring Parker. It was a bold and exciting take on the character at the time, and people appreciated not having to see Uncle Ben die on screen for the millionth time. This approach from Spider-Man kicked off a trend of origin stories being de-emphasized in superhero movies. It's actually even become standard practice for Marvel Studios when it comes to characters who are popular enough with even the more casual fans. And yet, some people have always wondered about Tom Holland's origin story. It is kinda weird that Aunt May, who was a major character across the Home trilogy, never even mentioned Uncle Ben. At the end of the day, the loss of Uncle Ben would have been a major incident of Peter's life. And yet Peter genuinely cares more for people like Tony and Happy rather than his hypothetical uncle. So was Uncle Ben a thing in the MCU, or wasn't he? Someone please tell us. Next, we do know who not to turn to for an answer though. Of all the people who would know the answer to the mystery of Peter Parker's origins, Christopher Marcus would be one of them. He and his partner in crime, Stephen McFeely, were the screenwriters for the Captain America trilogy, meaning they helped introduce us to Tom Holland. Along with that, they also wrote the screenplays for Avengers: Infinity War and Endgame, further solidifying them as MCU experts. So what does Christopher Marcus have to say about Peter's backstory? According to With Great Power, written by Marcus, Marvel isn't interested in addressing this point at all. He himself can only say that he thinks he was bitten by a radioactive spider on a field trip. This wasn't something he agreed on with Kevin Feige and the gang, but this is essentially his headcanon. Another person who isn't in the know is John Watts. Having directed the Home trilogy, he's the only director to have done an entire trilogy in the MCU. For his part, he was just happy that he never had to deal with Peter's origins. If these people don't know Peter's origin story, it can only mean that no one ever sat down and came up with it. This would be pretty weird, as even if these details would never be covered on screen, you'd think that they'd be important for screenwriters and directors to get the character himself right. Finally, does this mean we should drop the question altogether? At this point, the only one who could shed some light on Peter's origin story is Kevin Feige himself, and he clearly isn't interested in talking about this subject. But you know, the longer the MCU goes on and the more Peter's story unfolds, the less relevant his backstory is going to become. The fact is that Uncle Ben and the radioactive spider don't usually have anything to do with Spider-Man besides being the foundation of the hero. There's one exception to this rule. Storylines involving Oscorp and the Osborn family do sometimes stretch into Peter's backstory. For example, in the Andrew Garfield franchise as well as the Ultimate Spider-Man comics, Oscorp were the ones who created the radioactive spiders. But with Willem Dafoe reprising the role of Norman Osborn in No Way Home, Feige has confirmed we won't be seeing him and probably his company in the future. So it looks like Peter's life before Civil War isn't going to be important. In fact, when we look at Peter's story in the MCU, it's clear that Marvel Studios wants the Home trilogy to be his origin story. Tony Stark fills in the role that Uncle Ben would normally play, and Peter's experiences with the Vulture, Mysterio, and the multiverse have shaped him into the great power and great responsibility character we know and love. So yeah, it's time to leave the MCU Peter Parker's origins alone. That's it for today's video. Would you like to see Tobey Maguire back as Spider-Man? Or do you think Andrew Garfield should be the one to serve as Sony's Spidey? And do you agree that we should leave Tom Holland's origin story alone? Let us know in the comments section below. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.